in-person events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything confirmed, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phone so as not to disrupt the event. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right, hiding behind the pillar for some of you. Please line up there and speak clearly so that everyone can hear your question and it can be captured as well for the taping. We are pleased to welcome Jeffrey Toobin to talk about his most recent book, The Pardon. In this deeply reported narrative, he recreates the behind-the-scenes political melodrama during the tumultuous period leading up to and following Nixon's resignation. The narrative features a rich cast of characters, including Alexander Haig, Nixon's last chief of staff, who pushed for the pardon, and a young Justice Department lawyer named Antonin Scalia, who provided the legal justification. The pardon also introduces you to a largely forgotten figure, Benton Becker, the Washington lawyer sent personally by Ford to negotiate the pardon with Nixon. Becker's fresh reflections provide a startling and cinematic picture of the former president, who proved a master manipulator even in exile. Toobin argues that Ford's pardon was a disaster, an unwise gift to an undeserving recipient, and one that creates an unsettling precedent that was likely to be tested by occupants of the Oval Office. The Pardon is a must-read for anyone interested in American history, the complex dynamics of power within the highest office in the nation, and the implications of presidential mercy. As The Guardian states, it is the book for our tempestuous times. Jeffrey Toobin, the longtime CNN legal commentator and contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, is the author of 10 books, including the 9 Inside the Secret World of the Supreme Court, The Run of His Life, The People versus O.J. Simpson, Homegrown, Timothy McVeigh and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism, American Heiress, The Oath, Too Close to Call, and A Vast Conspiracy. A magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School, he lives with his family in New York. Please welcome Jeffrey Toobin.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. How's everybody doing here? It's great to be back in Washington. It's good not to live here, though. It's like, I wouldn't want to live here these days, but that's a separate subject. Thank you all for coming. I want to talk about the pardon a little bit. And first, and then, of course, take your questions. But I thought I'd talk about sort of the origin of the pardon power, why there is a pardon power in the Constitution. And it's an anomaly in the Constitution. The Constitution is based on the idea of checks and balances, but this is not a power that can be checked or balanced in any way. Congress can't override a pardon. Congress can't make a president pardon someone. The legislature, the courts can't impose a pardon or stop a pardon. It is a almost unique within the Constitution in terms of its the unilateral ability of a president to grant one or not grant one. And for that reason, because presidents have so much power in this area, I view it, and what's one of the themes of the book, is that pardons operate as a kind of X-ray into the souls of presidents. You can learn a lot about presidents by whom they decide to pardon and whom they don't decide to pardon, and that was true all the way from the beginning. The pardon power is very much the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton. That's not surprising because in the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Hamilton was the leading advocate for a broad executive power. He's the one who was advocating the creation of a president. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no president. And he's the one who wrote in several different Federalist Papers that it was important that the power of the president include the power to pardon. It's the part of the It's the part of the Constitution that is most directly descended from the power of the King of Great Britain. It is the king had a pardon power, and it was limited only by um, the, Britain has an unwritten constitution, but it still has a constitution, and in that constitution, as of the 18th century, the king could not pardon for impeachments by the by Parliament, and that carried over. Under the Constitution, one of the very few limitations on the pardon power is that the president can't pardon for impeachment. But other than that, there really are no limitations on the presidential pardon power. The only two meaningful ones are the president can only pardon for federal offenses, not for state offenses, and the president can only pardon for events in the past. The president can't give you a license to violate the law in the future. But other than that, it's very much open season. And in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton had two main justifications for the pardon power. One pretty obvious, the other, I think, pretty revealing. The first is it was a way of dispensing mercy. It was a way for the president to ameliorate very harsh sentences. And that's what it was, and that's what it still is. The other thing Hamilton said was it was a way of calming the political waters after periods of political upset and even rebellion. So Hamilton saw from the very beginning that the pardon power was a political tool as well as simply an instrument of mercy. And that arose almost immediately when George Washington was president, when there was a rebellion in way out west in the United States, which meant Pennsylvania. And that was the Whiskey Rebellion, which was a fairly modest rebellion. But George Washington, taking Hamilton's advice, pardoned all the people who were involved as a way of saying we are going to move on from this in a without vengeance. Much more consequentially, after the Civil War, or as the Civil War was ending, Abraham Lincoln dealt with the same problem on a just much grander scale, where Lincoln said, I am going to issue pardons, sort of a group pardon for the Southern soldiers who were in rebellion. Technically, they were all guilty of treason, but Lincoln said, if you pledge allegiance to the Union, we will excuse you from any criminal prosecution. And that worked out pretty well, even though, obviously Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson took over, who was much more sympathetic to the South and wound up pardoning a lot of the more senior Southern leaders, including Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, which caused a lot of the radical Republicans a lot of upset. After the Civil War, the pardon power actually was fairly widely used by presidents because there was no such thing as parole in federal prison in those days. And the only way you could get out before your term was out was if you got a pardon. And presidents, with some regularity, issued pardons. They were asked by judges, they were asked by members of Congress, and there were a lot of pardons in the latter half of the 19th century. Rutherford B. Hayes, don't hear a lot about Rutherford B. Hayes, but Rutherford B. Hayes granted 1,000 pardons, including to 44 people on death row. The pardon power, once parole came in the federal system in the 1920s, pardons kind of died out because presidents sort of left it to the parole system. Didn't disappear entirely. And the only, I think, really interesting pardon of this era took place in 1920. When I'm sure many of you here remember, or not remember, know who Eugene Debs is. Eugene Debs was the great socialist leader who ran for president many times. I think he ran 6 times, received millions of votes over the years. But in 1920, he ran for president from prison. He had been convicted in a really outrageous case where he had given a speech against American involvement in World War I, and he had been prosecuted for that speech, clearly a speech that would have been protected by the First Amendment today, I think. And he was in prison in 1920, and in the election of 1920, Warren Harding had been elected. Warren Harding was concerned that Debs, who was ailing and old at that point, was going to die in prison, and he didn't think that was right. So this is what Harding did. He told Debs, who was in prison in Atlanta, to get on a train and come to Washington and meet with the Attorney General, Harry Doherty, to talk about the prospect of a pardon. And that's what Debs did. He got on a train, he talked to Harry Doherty, and they discussed it. And then Eugene Debs got on a train and took himself back to prison in Atlanta. Shortly thereafter, Warren Harding issued a pardon to Debs and actually invited him to meet with him at the White House. And Harding said, "Gosh, I'd always wanted to meet you." And they had a very congenial meeting. This is the best story about Warren Harding I have ever heard. But got to give the guy credit. It was a good thing he did. And but at that point, the pardons kind of died out. There were not really many pardons, not many controversial pardons. And that's one reason why in 1974, it was so shocking and controversial that Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. And just to set the scene a little bit for that, which is obviously, you know, a main part of my book, although it's not the whole book, is who are these people? Who are Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon? Well, I suspect if there's one thing you all know about Gerald Ford, is that he was a terrific football player for the University of Michigan in his day. And it was not just it was a formative experience for him. And throughout his political career, the value that really mattered to him was being a team player. That's something he took very seriously. He was elected to Congress, to the House in Michigan in 1948, and his great cause during that period was to try to get a Republican majority. He was the minority leader in the House, and he tried term after term to become Speaker. Never did, but you know, he was a Republican team player, and that's the way he approached his vice presidency. Now, again, to refresh your recollection, in October, as the lawyers like to say, in October of 1973, Spiro Agnew, the vice president, resigned in a scandal that was entirely separate from Watergate, just a classic sort of bribery scandal from when he was both the county executive and then governor in Maryland. And in fact, amazingly, was still getting payoffs in the old executive office building while he was vice president. So Agnew resigns in October, and Nixon becomes the first president to employ the terms of the 22nd Amendment, which had passed, I believe, in 1965. Until that point, if there was a vacancy in the vice presidency, there was no way of filling it. When FDR died and Harry Truman took over, there was no vice president until Truman was elected in his own right. When JFK was assassinated, LBJ became president, but there was no vice president until LBJ was elected. But the 22nd Amendment changed that, and Nixon had the opportunity to appoint a vice president who had to be confirmed by both the House and the Senate. But Nixon had a problem, is that the Democrats controlled both the House and Senate, so he had to pick someone who was at least somewhat acceptable to the Democrats. And he settled on Gerald Ford, because although Ford was a strong partisan, he was someone who had never really made any political enemies during his long tenure in the House. He was best friends and favorite golfing partner with Tip O'Neill, who was his exact counterpart, the majority leader for the Democrats. And he was confirmed with ease. But the way, and so he took over shortly after the new year in 1974. But Ford was very concerned about, as I said, being a team player. And he um, undertook his job as vice president very much aware that he did not want to be perceived as scheming to get Nixon's job. And Watergate was heating up during this period, and Ford tried to stay as far away from that as possible, even physically, because he spent most of his time on the road campaigning for Republican candidates in the 74 midterm elections. But he also just didn't even learn what was really going on in Watergate, and he didn't know all the details. He made, and he intentionally just didn't find out, and that led to big problems for him once he became president. Again, just to refresh your memory, what happened was on August 8th, Nixon announced his resignation. On August 9th, Ford became president at noon, and he gave a speech in the East Room of the White House where he said the most famous thing he ever said, which is, "Our long national nightmare is over," which I think captured the way a lot of people felt about the end of Watergate. And Ford was enormously popular from the beginning, from August 9th. But he realized that there was he realized gradually that there were still big problems regarding Nixon. On August 24th, Ford had his first press conference as president, and he was asked several questions about Nixon, including about an issue that he had no idea about, which was who owns the Watergate tapes and who owns Nixon's papers. This is just not something Ford had thought about. And Ford was very irritated by the press conference, so he went to his attorney general, who and asked him, like, what is this issue with owning these presidential papers? And the attorney general turned to a young lawyer on his staff, Claire mentioned earlier, Antonin Scalia. And Antonin Scalia was assigned to write a memo about about these papers. And Scalia characteristically wrote a very eloquent memo, but was actually also rather clever, because what he said in the memo was, well, there is a tradition that the president owns all his papers, and there's a custom that the president gets to take all his papers home with him. But what Scalia didn't say, but was true, is there was no law that said a president got to keep his papers. All the presidents to that point had taken their papers. Lyndon Johnson had taken all of his papers home to Austin, Texas, but that was just a tradition. And Ford was now in the position of what to do with these tapes, which were evidence in a criminal investigation, including that at that very moment, in the fall of 74, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, and a few others were about to go on trial in the Watergate cover-up. But Nixon wanted his papers. Nixon, through Alexander Haig, his chief of staff, was demanding his papers. And Ford didn't know what to do. And Ford, he wound up not turning over the papers, which I thought was a very courageous and appropriate decision, given the fact that they were evidence in this criminal case. But the issue remained of, like, what to do with them and how long to keep them, and this really was bothering Ford. All through this period, starting in the last week of Nixon's presidency, Alexander Haig was operating as a double agent, in effect. He was pushing for a pardon for Nixon while still nominally serving Ford as his chief of staff. And one of the things he presented to Ford was that if Ford were to pardon Nixon, a lot of these problems would go away. He wouldn't be plagued by all these questions about what he was going to do with the papers, what he was going to do with Nixon. And Ford, again, had not done any research on the question of his pardon power, what to do. So this is an example of how Ford didn't really, I think, take this whole issue seriously enough, because he wanted to know, what was the law on pardons? Did he talk to the White House counsel? Did he talk to the Justice Department? No. He went to find his old friend, young friend, Benton Becker, who was a 35-year-old private lawyer who had worked with Ford a little bit in the Justice Department, and in Congress, and had just gone into private practice. And Ford said to him, over Labor Day weekend, go find an open library and tell me about what the pardon power is. And that's how Gerald Ford learned about pardons. And when Benton Becker found an open library, he found what he thought was the key to the whole story. He found a Supreme Court case from 1915, a case he had never heard of, a case I had never heard of until I started working on this book. But this was very important to Benton Becker, and it's an actually very interesting case. 1915, United States against George Burdick. George Burdick was a crusading newspaper reporter from New York who exposed a bunch of corruption in the Customs Service. The U.S. attorney wanted to follow up on it, called Burdick to the grand jury. Burdick said, I'm not testifying, I'm taking the fifth. The U.S. attorney said, oh yeah? Well, I'm going to get President Woodrow Wilson to issue you a presidential pardon so you don't have a Fifth Amendment right. You can't be prosecuted. And he did. He got him a presidential pardon. Burdick said, I'm still not testifying. They locked him up. They put him in prison for contempt, but Burdick appealed and went to the Supreme Court, and Burdick won. So why did Burdick win? Well, the Supreme Court said it's not enough to give someone a pardon. They have to accept it in order to be effective, and Burdick hadn't accepted it. And furthermore, Burdick said, the Supreme Court said, acceptance of a pardon is an acknowledgement of guilt. And this was something that became very meaningful to Benton Becker and then ultimately to Ford. And Ford convinced himself that because of this language in the Supreme Court, that he would have to convince Nixon to accept a pardon because he wouldn't want to acknowledge guilt. Now, this to me is an illustration of the limits of a law school education. This stray remark in a Supreme Court case effectively means nothing. To this day, no one really believes that accepting a pardon is an acknowledgement of guilt. The January 6th folks are not suffused with guilt because of what they did. They realize they got a gift. And that's what pardons are. They are gifts. And but Ford, this is how Nixon's one way that Nixon sort of flipped the script. Instead of being a supplicant for a pardon, it turned into that Ford was trying to talk Nixon into a pardon, and Nixon wanted a pardon. But in this crazy cloak and dagger way that this whole undertaking was conducted, he sent Benton Becker on a Air Force jet with Nixon's lawyer, Jack Miller, and they went across the country to San Clemente, where Nixon was in exile, and they had this sort of 24 hours there where they thought they had to talk Nixon into accepting a pardon, which Nixon actually gladly accepted. And Ford, who was in an undue hurry to get this whole thing behind him, 24 hours later scheduled a speech at 11 in the morning on Sunday, September 8th, 1974, where he announced the pardon. This speech was so quickly scheduled that there was no time to set up a teleprompter. So if you go on YouTube and watch the speech, you see him reading from papers on his desk. In the primitive technology of those days, there wasn't time to set up a live transmission of the speech. So what happened was they taped it at about 11:06, and when he was done, they turned around and broadcast it a few moments later. And all of the goodwill that Ford had accumulated in his 1 month as president disappeared overnight. Ford completely miscalculated about how this pardon would be received. Ford really believed in good faith that this pardon would let the country move on, would sort of heal the wounds of Watergate. And it had precisely the opposite impact. It basically made Ford a participant in Watergate. And many people believe, I explore this in the book, it's not entirely clear, that it was one of the main reasons Ford lost to Jimmy Carter 2 years later. As a result of the controversy over the Ford pardon, there was kind of a stigma associated with pardons over the years. Interestingly, about the Ford pardon itself, Ford's pardon of Nixon, there has been a dramatic change in the conventional wisdom. And this is most clearly illustrated by something that happened in May of 2001. Senator Ted Kennedy, who was still a big liberal leader in those days, the Kennedy family gives an award every year at the Kennedy Library called the Profiles in Courage Award. And in 2001, Ted Kennedy gave that award to Gerald Ford. And Kennedy said, I criticized the pardon at the time, but I was wrong and you were right. It did heal the country. It was the right thing to do, and you were right and I was wrong. Bob Woodward, who the great Watergate hero, had denounced the pardon at the time. He wrote something around the same time saying Ford's pardon was the right thing to do. Just last year, when the Trump versus United States case was argued in the Supreme Court, just sort of in passing, one of the questions from Justice Kavanaugh was, the pardon came up, and he said, well, some people think Ford lost the election because of this, but everyone now agrees the pardon was the right thing to do. Well, I don't think everyone agrees, but I think Kavanaugh was right that there had been a big shift in the conventional wisdom. I think the conventional wisdom was right in the first place. I think the pardon was the wrong thing to do. It contributed to the belief that powerful people get away with things that ordinary people don't. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. But, I think it's important to carry the pardon story forward. And because of the stigma of the Nixon pardon, one thing presidents started to do after Ford was, for the most part, they jammed any controversial pardons to the very ends of their term, where they couldn't face any political accountability. When George Herbert Walker Bush pardoned all the Iran-Contra defendants, he did it at the very end of his term in office. When Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich, the infamous fugitive who was living in Switzerland, that was in the very end of his term. And what's really changed now, just to bring the story to the present, is just let's talk about Biden and Trump. Biden and Trump, again, I think fit very well with my idea that pardons are like X-rays into the souls of presidents. What do we know about Joe Biden? Joe Biden is and was someone extremely devoted to, maybe even obsessed with, his own family. And he probably has a better reason for it than most of us. He, as we all know, he lost his first wife and his daughter in a terrible car accident right after he was elected to the Senate. His son, Beau, died of cancer when he was vice president. And this is why, I think, he pardoned his son, because he felt like he could not expose his son to the sentencing that he was about to undergo, and also perhaps being prosecuted again by the incoming Trump administration. But it's my belief that even though you can understand his thinking, it was a terrible decision on the part of Joe Biden. And I think he even knew that, because he wouldn't have said publicly over and over again that he wasn't going to do it if he really thought, and then changed his mind about it. I think he recognized that he knew how controversial it would be, and I think it was the wrong thing to do. And then, in his very last day in office, he then pardons 5 other of his relatives who are not even under investigation, as far as anyone knows, which I thought was just indicative of how obsessed he was. And even though some of it was understandable. I mean, if any of us who know something about federal criminal prosecution, it was unusual what Hunter Biden faced. The charge regarding the false application in Delaware for his gun permit, the tax case in California. He got kind of a raw deal. But if you know anything about our criminal justice system, including our federal system, there are lots of people who get a raw deal. And the fact is that Hunter Biden was guilty of all the crimes he was convicted of and pleaded guilty to. And the only difference between Hunter Biden and those other people who got a raw deal is that Hunter Biden's father was president of the United States. And I don't think that's a legitimate justification for a pardon. Which brings me to President Trump. Now, one of the things that I think is clear about President Trump is that he is transactional in every part of his life. It's all about helping his friends and punishing his enemies. And if you look at how he's conducted the pardons, starting in the first term, everybody's talking about the second term pardons, but the first term pardons were just as outrageous, though fewer in number. What did he do? He pardoned everyone that Robert Mueller had prosecuted because he hated Robert Mueller. He pardoned his daughter's father-in-law, Charles Kushner, because he was family, and now Charles Kushner is going to be the ambassador to France. He pardoned a bunch of Republican congressmen who had been supportive of him, even though these Republican congressmen had been convicted of the most egregious corruption. And he pardoned any number, especially in the final days, of white-collar criminals who happened to have some connection to Jared Kushner or Alan Dershowitz or other people who were on the with the people who were close to him. That is how Trump operates. Everything is personal. Everything is transactional. And that, of course, explains, I think, the January 6 pardons. The January 6 pardons, which, were not a surprise. I mean, the only issue was how many was he going to pardon? Was he going to pardon everybody, including the violent criminals? But he had said over and over again he was going to pardon most of them, and he wound up pardoning all of them. And the key thing to remember about the January 6 defendants is that Donald Trump was also a January 6 defendant. He was not charged with, the violence at the Capitol, but he was charged in the Jack Smith investigation with trying to overturn the election through the use of the false electors, and that's why Trump was so devoted to the January 6 protesters, because they were on his side. That's why he called it a day of love. He recognized that the January 6 protesters were kindred spirits and that's why he wanted them pardoned. And if you look, he's continued these sorts of pardons um, in in um, in his first month or so as president. He and I think Trump has recognized that, especially with his supporters, he doesn't have to wait to the end like these other presidents. He is going to use pardons throughout this term to reward people who are allies. He's pardoned 23 people who were convicted of blocking or invading abortion clinics because the pro-life people are his people. He's pardoned Mr. Albrecht, who was the Silk Road crypto entrepreneur, who's a big favorite among the crypto world, and he pardoned Rod Blagojevich, the corrupt former governor of Illinois, who was turned into a big Trump supporter. So before I go to your questions, let me just anticipate one question that you might have, which is, you've just written this book about all these terrible pardons. Don't you think we should just get rid of the pardon power? And my answer to that question is absolutely not. I think the pardon power should be used, and it probably should be used more than presidents do. There are 150,000 people in federal prison in the United States. Not all of them should be there. But there are always going to be pressures among politicians for more incarceration and longer sentences and more draconian punishments. And the pardon power operates as a potential check on it. The only time it was ever used, I think, in a fully appropriate way was in the last year of President Obama's presidency, when he granted about 1,500 commutations of low-level drug offenders. The difference between a pardon eliminates a conviction altogether. It's as if you were never charged. A commutation simply ends your sentence in prison. Obama did, commutations more than pardons. But I think that was an appropriate thing to do. So my answer to the question about what should we do about pardons is we shouldn't get rid of pardons. We should have better presidents. And I leave that up to you. I'll take that. And please if you have questions, come to the microphone because we're broadcasting to millions and millions of Politics and Prose listeners. Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nathan, and I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College here in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm hoping ultimately to teach American history, to teach American and civil rights history. And my question is, I was reading towards the beginning of the book about the pardons that Presidents Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln issued. And I was wondering, with regards to Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, would you say that there's a pardon that any one of them issued that you think that in your research you found to be particularly interesting, significant, or important?
Well, as I said, the Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion pardons, I think were a good use of it to try to heal some wounds. Jefferson, the Alien and Sedition Acts by President Adams, really some very harsh sentences to people who were simply exercising their right to free speech. Jefferson pardoned them. I thought that was the right thing to do. And Lincoln, I think, in the spirit of his second inaugural with malice towards none, for charity for all, I think his pardons of the Southern soldiers it was called an amnesty rather than a pardon, was, I think, appropriate under the circumstances.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? My name is Dusty, and I noticed at the beginning of your talk, you said that you don't live in Washington, and I do, and I'm kind of nervous about living here in part because of the unlimited pardon power. And the scenario that I worry about, which is sort of linked to what happened on January 6th, 2021, is what happens if the current president, inspires his followers to attack people in Washington D.C. who speak out against the president?
Uh,
In D.C., a lot of the property is federal, so that they would be charged, if they were charged, under federal law. There is local D.C. law, but if push came to shove, I could.
But all of law enforcement in the District of Columbia is federal. Even what's arrests by the D.C. police, it all goes through the U.S. Attorney's Office, and so. But I mean,
and so my question is, what do you think about that possibility, and do you see a need to limit the pardon power, and how would you do that?
Okay. I mean, one fact is I don't know if it's surprising or not, but a considerable number of the people Trump has pardoned, both in the end of his first term and the January 6th people, have already gotten in trouble with the law again. They have already been arrested for other crimes. So your concern is not a frivolous one. And Enrique Ontario, one of the who was charged with sedition, he's been arrested again, just at the Capitol. The concern is that they take the pardon as a license to violate the law, even violently, with impunity. I understand your concern. I think at this point, I certainly wouldn't move out of Washington out of worrying about it. I mean, I do think, the rule of law is intact here, and I don't think there are going to be large-scale attacks on people who are opposed to the president. But look, I mean, there has been a very, the Justice Department and the justice system appears to have adopted the transactional model that Trump has advocated. I mean, this is why Eric Adams gets a sweet deal. This is why Covington and Burling gets thrown to the wolves. This is why, the abortion rights, anti-abortion people get pardoned. I mean, there's really a transactional approach, but I'm not prepared to say that there's going to be violence in the streets of the kind you described.
Okay.
I hope I'm right.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Hi.
Right.
I read your book a few years ago, the Oath about the Supreme Court. Really good book. I
Thanks.
highly recommend it. Big fan. My question is, near the beginning of your talk, you were saying that a pardon can't be nullified in any way. You gave two examples of Congress can't overturn it, and
Right.
the Supreme Court can't strike it down as unconstitutional. My question is, why can't a subsequent president overturn it? I mean, like, Donald's been president for like a month and a half now. It seems he spent half his time overturning executive orders from Joe, from Barack, even one from LBJ from 1965. So why can't the president just say, like, I overturn this pardon from my
I mean,
predecessor?
that's a great question, which I have never thought about. I don't think it can be overturned. I think a pardon is just a final order. I think it can't be. I mean, the country's been around for 250 years. No president has ever tried that, so we can't say the courts have the courts have answered that question. But I just don't think the courts would buy overturning a pardon. If I can just answer a question that the previous gentleman asked, and I think it's a really good question: is should the pardon power be limited? And I think the best answer to that is, I mean, as I said, I don't think it should be limited. However, there are 50 states with 50 governors, and there are lots of different rules for pardons in the 50 states. Some states have a rule like the federal system, which is you can governor can pardon anyone for anything, anytime. Some states have no pardon power at all. Other states, like Georgia, Delaware, for example, have a kind of check on the governor's part. There's a parole board, there's a pardon board that can overturn pardons. That, to me, if you're going to change the pardon power, that's something I would suggest. I certainly wouldn't say get rid of it, but some sort of check might not be out of the question. But if you wanted to change the pardon power For the president, you'd have to amend the Constitution, and that's fortunately very difficult.
So
to
would
do.
Donald be able to say, like, I'm overturning Joe's pardon of his son Hunter? Would that
No,
be? Couldn't?
no. I just don't think there is any. There's no history of that, and I think. I mean, if you read Article 2, Section 2, which is the part of the pardon power, there just doesn't appear to be any provision for undoing a pardon.
Interesting. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi, thanks for your talk.
Can you talk into the microphone?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Will. Thanks for your talk.
Hi.
You talked about the use as a way of reducing tension, and I was wondering if that still happens, if anyone pardons someone from the other side, or.
Well, I mean, that it could happen. I think Jimmy Carter, in his first day in office in 1977, issued an amnesty, a group pardon for the Americans who had fled to Canada to avoid the draft. And he said he was going to do it during the campaign. It wasn't a surprise. It was controversial, but he portrayed it as a healing gesture. Since he was a Democrat, he wasn't on the. It's not one on the other side. I'm trying to think of an example of pardoning someone on the other side. I mean,
It would be a nice.
Well, Harding, yeah. I mean, 1920 was a long time ago, but you're right. But no, I think that's a good example. The Whiskey Rebellion one is a good one. Lincoln is another. One of the other pardons that Biden issued at the very end was of Leonard Peltier, who was a Native American rights activist who was convicted of a terrible, I think, a murder, and had been in prison for 40 years or more in connection with that, and he pardoned him because enough time had passed. Yeah. But anyway, and one of the arguments in favor of the January 6 pardons was that it would be healing. I think it's a bogus argument, but that's one of the arguments.
Maybe if Biden had done it,
if Biden did, well, and actually one of the reasons I wrote the book is I knew that I knew that pardons would be big in the news in early 2025. I mean, Trump had certainly forecast that he was going to pardon the January 6 people, but there was also going to be pressure on Kamala Harris to pardon Trump if she won, especially because the conventional wisdom about the Ford pardon had changed so much. And Mitt Romney had already said that he thought Biden or Harris should pardon Trump. So I figured the subject would be in the air. I don't think Harris ultimately would have pardoned Trump, but certainly it would have been something I could talk about on book tour.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Yes, sir. Hi.
My name is Justin. I was
Hi.
going to ask you about posthumous pardons when people have passed away. Rosa Parks was pardoned. Marcus Garvey was pardoned by Biden a month or so ago. And do you see that as a particularly, generous, beneficent act as opposed to other pardons which may have more political elements?
Trump just said I either did or is going to pardon Pete Rose. Did he do it? And in his first term, Trump pardoned Jack Johnson, the famous boxer who had been convicted in the Mann Act of white slavery. It was it's interesting. It's not something I talked about in my book. To be honest, I think posthumous pardons are sort of bogus. I think they are sort of pointless posturing and ways of presidents trying to bathe themselves in the good vibes of people from the past. Pardons are controversial. Pardons are, presidents take risks by issuing pardons because people are alive and they could go out and commit more crimes if they pardon them. And I have no particular objection to posthumous pardons, but I think they are showboating and not of great significance.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Brad. Thanks. If Ford had taken your advice and not pardoned Nixon, how do you think it would have played out? And it's kind of a sub question on that. Can criminal convictions ever have any effect on election results? Thanks.
I'm sorry. What was the second question? I didn't quite get that.
Can criminal convictions ever have an effect, like to nullify election results, if you can prove that fraud
Oh,
occurred?
well, all right. Well, I mean, your first question is one that I address in the book, and it's actually a very interesting question. Is like, well, what if he didn't pardon him? One of the things that one of the results of Ford not consulting a wide group of people before this pardon is that he didn't find out a very important fact, which was that Leon Jaworski, who was the Watergate special prosecutor, didn't want to prosecute Nixon, and in all likelihood would never have prosecuted Nixon. So the pardon was fundamentally unnecessary. And Jaworski was the person who had to make that decision. He had a staff of aggressive young lawyers who really wanted to prosecute Nixon. And there was a case to be brought against Nixon, especially when you had at just that moment, in the fall of 1974, the Watergate cover-up trial going on, where the defendants were all acting at Nixon's direction and for Nixon's benefit. And one of the reasons the pardon was so unfair is they were going to trial and Nixon was getting off scot-free. But one of the reasons the pardon was such a terrible idea was that it was unnecessary, because he was never going to be pardoned, never going to be prosecuted in the first place. As for your question about whether a, say, convicted felon can be elected president of the United States, I have an answer for that. I mean, so obviously the answer, all you have to be in the United States is 35 years old and a native-born citizen. You can do whatever. I mean, obviously you can have.
Sorry, I didn't ask it right. I meant if you can prove retroactively that you tinkered with the election criminally, then does the election?
Oh, no, you couldn't invalidate an election. I mean, that question, came up about the Russia stuff in the first term. But no, there's no provision for invalidating an election once someone's sworn in. They can be impeached, of course, and thrown out, but they can't. You can't change the election.
Hi. In the beginning, you referenced how Great Britain's monarch pardon was an inspiration for Hamilton to put it into our constitution. Presumably, the UK no longer has that with the monarch, or if they do, it wouldn't actually be able to work. And my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, is most democracies around the world, or republics around the world, do not have a pardon. What is the prevailing argument, if you've researched this, for why not, particularly since you advocate for the advantage of it?
I've been on cable news for a long time, and there are 3 words you're never allowed to say on cable news. I don't know. And I don't know what the current law is in Great Britain on pardons, because I am sure it is not up to the king unilaterally. Because that's just not how the monarchy works. There may be some sort of provision for the prime minister to advise a pardon. There are not a lot of countries where there is a pardon power. That much I do know. And I think that the answer is very straightforward, which is there is a belief that we call it due process, we call it equal protection of the law. Other countries have different names for it. But the idea that the criminal justice system should treat people equally, and to have a president or a prime minister or a king or whoever's the head of state have the opportunity to overrule that is anathema. And I understand that position. I don't think it's a crazy position. I happen to support the pardon power here, but in most countries, I do know that in most countries they don't have a system like this.
Thanks.
Sure.
Yes, I agree with you on the pardon power. I was with Biden pardoning his family, although I do understand it because Trump is vindictive. I was glad to see him pardon Tony Fauci First thing Trump did was take away his Secret Service, going, he earns enough money, he can pay for it himself. And so I was glad to see that. But I think we need this carte blanche I have problems with,
Well, I'm sorry, what carte blanche?
of being able to pardon anybody for
Pardon
anything.
anyone?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I understand that.
Yeah.
I would like a rule where I have to approve all the pardons that are given, because that would really solve all the problems we have. You know, the president either has the power or he doesn't, and certainly, you know, the vindictiveness with which Hunter Biden has been treated over the past, you know, years is, you know, makes the pardon much more understandable. But you know, not, and you know, it's not like I'm unaware of that. I still think, given the fact that he did commit these crimes, he shouldn't have been pardoned.
Oh, no, I agree. I understand why he did it.
Yeah.
I just don't agree with it.
Then you and I agree. Yes.
You've covered a lot of this here, but I'm still unclear about details, and they all stem from a question very close to the one that you were asked early on in the line of people here about what are the chances that pardons could be used to give impunity to goon squads that the president wants to have at his or her disposal to attack violently or to intimidate or whatever. So the two questions that sort of pertain to this, because you have already sort of said probably don't need to worry about it. One is, do I understand that you can make a blanket pardon? That is, that you don't have to name individuals in order to create a pardon.
Well, that can be done. I mean, actually, the Nixon pardon, you know, almost everyone who's been pardoned in history has been pardoned for a specific crime.
Right.
Nixon was the first, certainly high-profile pardon, who was pardoned for all criminal activity during his 7+ years or 6+ years as president. And Hunter Biden got a pardon like that too. It wasn't just for the cases that he was charged with. I do think it's important to recognize that, you know, Donald Trump or any president can't give immunity for future crimes. So if there's an interesting legal issue that has come up with a couple of these pardons. We're almost out of time. I don't want to, you know, as my father used to say, to make a long story unbearable. There are a few cases where the FBI went searching for someone in a January 6th case. They arrested him for January 6th, but they also found evidence of other crimes which they prosecuted them for. The question is whether the pardon applies to those other crimes. And there are, I think, several cases like that before judges in the District of Columbia. And I don't think they've been resolved yet. But, you know, I do think it's important to point out that, you know, even though the January 6 people are, you know, out and about now, they do not have a pardon for any future acts that they might commit.
Right.
So, one more question before we go?
Okay, but I have two questions.
All right, go for it.
The first is, I'm confused. The president swears an oath to the Constitution, and yet he has the power to pardon people who violate the Constitution. Can you explain that?
Because the Constitution says he can pardon people, so he is exercising his
So it
and
seems like
and remember, by definition, pardons excuse violation of law. That's what pardons are. So it's not like you can only issue pardons to law-abiding citizens because they don't need pardons.
It seems like an inherent contradiction, though, for pardoning people who have committed treason. I mean,
well,
it seems like there should be some limits.
Well,
the second question is, can the president pardon himself?
Oh, what a great question!
It's his question.
And the answer can I do this since we're at the very end? Read my book. It's got a whole discussion of that. But I mean, the short answer is, I think the answer is yes. I mean, no president has ever pardoned himself, so we, the courts have never had an opportunity to test it. But if you believe, the dominant interpretive mode in the Supreme Court these days is textualism, whereas they are bound by the text, and it comes up in the abortion context. It's like, well, the Constitution doesn't say anything about abortion, so it's not protected under the Constitution. The Constitution does not prohibit a president from pardoning himself. It just speaks of the pardon power, and I think if push came to shove, this court would uphold a self-pardon. But, and again, this is somewhat off topic, in light of the Supreme Court's decision in Trump v. United States, it's virtually impossible to prosecute a president for anything anyway, so he's not going to need a self-pardon. But on that happy note, thank you all for coming. I'd be happy to sign your books.